thanks everybody for being here. I will preface my comments by saying that I am definitely not an expert in livestock issues. I'm an expert in border policy, but Janice had asked me to provide kind of an overview of a little bit of the data and the economics. And so all of the data I'm going to show you is from U.S. government sources, so it's kind of looking at what's coming into the U.S. from Canada and what's going out of the U.S. to Canada. And everything is also in U.S. dollars, just to give you that context. So, does this thing work? Maybe not. So this graph up top is actually just a screenshot from the U.S. government database that shows the top U.S. ports transporting live animals in 2022. And I was kind of Googling this site, and what really struck me was how Sweetgrass is the #1 port in the entire country for trade in live animals, and this is from 2022. And below is just sort of an overview that shows you the ports in Washington, Idaho, and Montana that either both import and export live animals. So you can see Sweetgrass really does stand out there, and then Eastport, Idaho, as well as being really high volume, high value ports for the trade in live animals. Well, do you guys want to advance it in the back? It's kind of doing weird. Should I just tell you next slide? Would that be better? Okay. So I have a few different statistics: live animals, cattle, and then livestock as well. And so live animals would be the broadest category, livestock would be sort of the second broadest, and then cattle just being cattle, of course. So this is, again, an overview of the movement of cattle across the U.S.-Canada border. So this is imports from Canada into each of these states. You can see Washington has the biggest importer. I think it's about $288 million worth of cattle from Canada. I think a lot of that is coming in to feedlots in Washington State. My sister-in-law actually runs a feedlot in Eastern Washington, so I have a tiny bit of knowledge about how her operation works. And then, of course, Montana, Oregon, and Idaho being much lower net importers of cattle from Canada. Next slide. And then it's sort of it switches a little bit when we look at exporters of cattle to Canada, with Montana really dominating that market, $130 million just of cattle moving from Montana into Canada. And then Washington, Oregon, and Idaho also having really considerable economic benefits in terms of exports of cattle. Next slide. So a little bit of an economic contribution of cross-border cattle trade, and this is just kind of a broad overview to set the context. And what I did was I averaged 2021 and 2022 because shifts in commodity prices can kind of throw off individual years, so I decided to use that as the metric. Click. So Canada-U.S. cross-border cattle trade averaged $1.3 billion, and Janice already kind of mentioned that. And our exports to Canada were $347 million, and then our imports were $974 million. So we're importing a lot more than we're exporting, and again, Washington State is kind of dominating that import market. Click. And then the PNWER states, I didn't include Alaska, but Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington account for 40% of all cross-border cattle trade with Canada. And how that breaks down is around 70% of all exports between the U.S. and Canada of cattle come through those 4 states, about $244 million. And then about 30% of all of the cattle imported from Canada into the U.S. goes to those 4 states, about $293 million. And that's just in 1 year. Next slide. So if you sort of break down those states just to give you a sense of how each one occupies a piece of the pie, U.S. exports of cattle to Canada. Montana, again, dominates that market. 37% of all exports to Canada of cattle are coming from Montana, followed by Idaho, Washington, and then Oregon, and then the rest of the country, about 30%. So those 4 states are really, really incredibly significant for Canadian exports of cattle. Next slide. And then if we look at the imports, it's kind of strange to show the pie chart because Oregon and Idaho and Montana don't actually even show up as their own slices because they are not importing as much, right? They're exporters. But again, Washington State being kind of the outlier, $287 million. Next slide. So, and then the economic contribution of cross-border livestock, which also includes in the U.S. government database livestock products as well, so a little bit of a broader perspective on that. Canada-US cross-border trade in livestock and livestock products was $3.5 billion in 2022, so a whole other level of economic exchange. Our exports to Canada were $840 million, and our imports from Canada were $2.6 billion. And those same four states, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, account for about 20 or 19% of cross-border livestock products, 30% of exports, and 15% of imports. And so then my last slide is just kind of some additional considerations from the border perspective. As many of you I'm sure know, the vast majority of live animals move by truck. That means that they're incredibly dependent on the border and how the border itself is functioning. We'll talk about that I think a lot more later in the other panels about the vulnerability associated with that. Of course, the supply chain relationships we have, we see that particularly with Washington State, where we're importing a lot of cattle and we are putting them on feedlots, and then if they do get exported back to Canada, of course, they're not captured in that same database. But feedlots certainly can face higher input costs and kind of adjusting if they have to hold their cattle longer because they can't get them into trucks and across the border. And then I think I just wanted to point out too that it's not just about moving animals, it's of course about moving products and feed as well. And so, of course, border closures that might hold up a truck full of cows may also affect what feed can get to those cows and how quickly that feed can move back and forth. And that can, I think, really spiral out into broader supply chain situations that really start at the border and then can continue through the supply chain system. So that's it for me. Hopefully that's a helpful overview, and if anybody would like any of those numbers, I think Janice has my PowerPoint. Feel free to use any of that if it's helpful. Thanks.
Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, just one real quick question for clarity on your data. Is that just beef cattle, or does it also include dairy cattle? And then in addition to that, do you know how many of those account for slaughter-only animals that come down from Canada? Because we do a lot of that as well.
It's all cattle, but the databases don't distinguish between, they're live cattle.
Okay.
That's all we know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Was there? No, okay. Great, thanks. Thanks, Lori. Again, we just kind of wanted that to set the stage so that the audience could understand that this is, you know, it's a lot of activity, a lot of trucks that are coming back and forth across the border, and as she mentioned that, you know, sweetgrass and coots are really important, but as well is it's Emerson, and what's Pembina is another one that's a really large border crossing. So with that, I think what we'll do next is we're going to bring up a little bit of a panel to talk about just some examples of different constrictions to the border that has happened in the last little while. So I'm gonna just call you guys up if that's okay, and we can sit here and then we can maybe do some questions. So I've got Mike Honeycutt, who is the executive officer with the Montana Department for Livestock, and Dr. Amber Idle, who is the Washington State vet. And I never did introduce myself. That's always what happens when you're the coordinator. So I'm Janice Tramberg, and I'm the CEO with both the Alberta and National Cattle Feeders. So if it's okay, Mike, maybe we'll go Mike, Amber, and myself.
Does that work? Wanted up here to make sure, because you know it's such a big room and we're all spread out, so we're good at using the entire room with a small group here. As Jan said, I'm Mike Honeycutt. I serve as the Executive Officer for the Montana Department of Livestock, and my presentation today will be a little bit narrative, and what I will say is I will walk you through a little bit of evolution since I came to the Department of Livestock in Montana in February of 2016, of my thinking about the border and the interplay between the Montana, particularly cattle industry, and our neighbors to the north, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan. As you can tell from the accent, I'm not a native Montanan, so I came to the Pacific Northwest sort of naive to a lot of these issues, so I was able to greet them without a lot of history and context as they came to me. I would say in Montana, we've always had a pretty good understanding on the pork and the poultry side of what our connectivity to Canada is. So in Montana, large Majority of those industries are controlled by our Hutterite colonies who have strong family and cultural connections to Canada. And so we knew there was a lot of interplay there. I think cattle was less understood, and I think cattle was less appreciated over the years in Montana. And one example I'll give of that is a regulation we finally got rid of this past year, but for 20 years we held our requirement for Canadian origin animals that were going to be in Montana for any amount of time to have a hot iron CAN brand placed on them. That was a relic of BSE. It was something that our Canadian friends wanted us to get rid of for a long time, but we didn't see the value of that. And I'll tell you how that thought process changed just in the last year through this evolution of understanding how connected our industries are to our partners in the North. So the first thing that I would share is that was sort of helped us with that understanding was, different incidences that occurred that we had to deal with. So the first time we sort of had understanding of that is anecdotally, we see a lot of cattle headed down I-15. So to Lori's presentation earlier, and you talk about the percentage of imports, Montana doesn't show up on there, but a lot of those cattle going to other states in the U.S. are coming through Montana on their way there. And we could see that on our interstates. You see those trucks coming from the feedlots every day. We didn't understand how some of those trucks are going back loaded with feeder cattle headed north. That became apparent to us right in the COVID era, and I think it was we had a retirement, and USDA decided to move some processes to veterinarians that were in the Eastern time zone, which became a problem for us. And I got lots of complaints from veterinarians about sales that were happening in Montana and needing to process cattle to get them across the border after the sale, particularly late week sales that were ending at 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And sometimes these cattle were getting held up for 1-2 days over a weekend before they could get processed out. And the complaint was about, we've got to feed, we've got to water, we've got to house these cattle until we can get them processed and through either Port of Raymond or through Coots and Sweetgrass. And so what that did for us is, one, I didn't have a context of how big a problem that was. And one of our veterinarians, one day in Lewistown, Montana, when I questioned him, well, how many cattle are we talking? And I expected to hear one potload potentially. 80% of the cattle in that sale that day in Lewistown, those feeder cattle had gone to Canadian buyers and were headed north. It was significant, right? And so now I began to understand Canadian buyers were a significant player in the Montana market for feeder cattle, just as significant as the buyers that are coming to fill the feedlots in the Midwest. We didn't really have as good an understanding of that as we should. During COVID, we also undertook a lot of steps to ramp up meat processing like most people did within Montana. We were very successful. Within the course of 2 years, we've doubled the capacity of meat processing in Montana. But with that came outlets for Canadians to process cattle in Montana versus them going through Montana. And that's how the can branding first step came about was we had processors who said, why do we want to put a hot iron can brand on these cattle and devalue them, devalue the hides, potentially have dark cutters, devalue the meat? They're only here for a day. So we relaxed our can branding requirement and exempted direct slaughter cattle. But now we understood that we were creating a processing market for Canadian cattle that were having to traverse that border. The death knell of the can brand, probably within the last 6 months, was a lot of genetic businesses that have sprung up along the high line. And again, why am I going to can brand an animal when I'm just sending it, I want to send it down for semen collection or flushing embryos. I want to work with these genetic businesses. They're literally, dozens of miles as the crow flies from me, but they are across an international border, so that creates a problem. So we rolled the can brand all the way back at that time. But now we had an understanding of the genetics business that was happening between us and our northern neighbors. So we've had a complete evolution of our understanding. The last example that I would give that actually played out a scenario we'd always looked at in reverse, which was during a foreign animal disease outbreak, if the border shut down, knowing the number of trucks that are headed north up our interstates or headed towards Port of Raymond loaded with cattle, that at any time we could have lots and lots of trucks stacking up at our Canadian border in Montana's jurisdiction that we now have to figure out. And we got a little piece of that this winter. The Oneida Pass closed down due to inclement weather, and not insignificantly, there were roughly 24 trucks, Canadian origin, sealed USDA trailers, that were between Monida Pass and Coots at the time of that closure. And so then our job was to try, along with USDA partners, to figure out what we were gonna do with these cattle until it opened up. And so luckily, a lot of our commission companies, stockyards, were very cooperative. We were able to offload the cattle. We were able to feed and water them until the pass opened up. USDA were able to get the re-inspection, get trailers sealed, and get them back on the road. But that also gave us an understanding of what is happening on our roadways through Montana at any given time, and how any disruption in that transportation cycle can create a backlog and an emergency situation. And so what that led to, and the closing statement is that, you know, we're looking for ways to prevent and get more options. We have 2 border ports in Montana that are handling most of those cattle. You see that Coots and Sweetgrass is obviously the busiest one. We need more options for processing livestock across the Montana border. It's hundreds of miles between those borders. I think there's a lot of economic opportunity that may be lost because of how people have to move around there. We're always looking for more bidders in our space. We know that helps our livestock producers. So we want more options for processing cattle across borders. We also know we need to deal with this regionally, this foreign animal disease question. In the case of a border closure, you know, what are we going to do with these trucks that are stacking up on the other side? How do we prevent an animal welfare crisis? And how can we get some logical thinking about how we might have to deal with that differently than just the hard stop border closure that we've always talked about between the 2 entities? We just had our governor in May wrote a letter along with Premier Mo from Saskatchewan to both Ottawa and DC, asking for more border ports on the Montana-Saskatchewan border to be able to process cattle. I've had conversations with Alberta colleagues while I've been here about a similar letter with our governor and premier of the same type, trying to encourage both USDA and CFIA to open up more options across that border. 1, it's good for commerce. 2, it'll be a relief valve in foreign animal disease situations, and also give us more routes for people to traverse to get to the marketplaces in the U.S. to avoid situations like we had this winter. So with that sort of takes you through the whole evolution I've had on the border and why I've come to the sort of beliefs that I have about what we need to do with livestock border crossings, not just in Montana, but across the whole Pacific Northwest.
Thanks, that was great, a great segue. I wanted to start, I'm going to take a little bit different approach. So last year when we were here at our PNWER meeting, I don't know how many of you made it last year, but I addressed some of the disaster issues we had with movement of feed and movement of trucks and, you know, our supply chain disruptions with the flood. So I'm not going to touch on that too much today. I do want to address the can brand issue, because I think one thing that's important to bring up in this group is for people to understand that even between states, we lack harmonization in our regulations. It's something that we've been working on, but it's very difficult. Some people have it in rule and they can change it easily. Some of it's in statute. So it can be very, very difficult for us to change our rules and laws in our states and then to harmonize them, because our industries, you know, we really, as state veterinarians, we're really listening to our industry and saying, what do you care about? What do you want us to regulate? What do we need to regulate? Whether that's trichomoniasis or brucellosis or whatever it is. So in our state, because of BSE 20 years ago, I mean, most of our producers are feeling pretty like, well, they're hanging on to the can brand, right? So we still have that requirement on our books because people want to be able to go out and quickly find that animal. So if she loses her tag, and even though we have RFID tags, there's still a big concern about being able to rapidly identify animals, whether they're in a feedlot or they're a breeding stock dairy animal. And so it's really hard to change that, just change the perception around whether that's needed anymore or not. So I do think it's a really good issue or a good topic to keep bringing up with our industry groups and asking them, you know, whether that's still relevant. The next thing I want to do is just quickly point out Dr. Mara Gibson. She is our area veterinarian in charge for Washington and Alaska. And I'm really glad she's here because she really understands the ports. She works closely with the port veterinarians, and she just explained to me today how there's these different arms. There's operational arms, and then there's trade policy arms. So we may say, hey, I want more ports, but if we don't get that into the right hands or into the right policy group, it's not going to change anything. So if we're trying to change something on operations, that's different than if we're trying to actually get a policy changed. So if we need more ports, that's one person. If we need to change trade policy and how things move through a port, that's a different group of people. So I just wanted to point that out to this group as well, that sometimes these port issues, it isn't just one person or one group, and those groups don't always work together day to day, but I would love, after I'm done speaking, to give Maury Gibson a chance to just maybe give you a quick overview of the functionality of how this works with USDA APHIS in our ports. So thanks for being here, Dr. Gibson. This morning I showed this slide that we have these two priorities, and I addressed the second priority this morning, so I'm not going to go into that again and all the disease issues, because we did already talk about that this morning, and we are planning to address that through our tabletop exercises. And then today, we're really still focused on the ports, and it would be great. I know for years we always have somebody come and we talk about, let's get an update on electronic projects and what's going on, and can we move cattle through ports without having to have a veterinary inspection if there isn't one available? Is there some other mechanism to do this if we can show that those animals have been inspected prior to movement? So I think we're overdue for an update on that, so I would suggest maybe next year we get that on our agenda from USDA ports and also CFIA to just find out where we are with electronic movement of cattle to try to address some of those issues. So as I talked about this morning, a lot of what we're concerned about as state veterinarians is, these reportable diseases. So those, it may be a disease we have a diagnosis for, it might just be something that looks like a foreign animal disease. But anytime we have an animal with lesions that looks like it could be a foreign animal disease, we need to do an investigation. And so it's really important for us to do that. And I don't know if Dr. Lee, who was just in the swine meeting, talking about the One Health lens. And it's very, very important. We do need to think about the One Health lens. Where are we with zoonotic diseases and public health, and how does that interface with environmental health, whether that's something feral pigs are doing, or whether that's antimicrobial resistance, or whether that's whatever it is. And then same with the animal health side, thinking about emerging diseases and zoonotic disease and how they interplay. So vesicular stomatitis is the disease I'm going to focus on next to show an example of a problem we've had at the border. And that is a zoonotic disease. So it does have a public health implication. It also crosses species. So it's primarily in horses, but it can also show up in ruminants and look like foot and mouth disease because it can cause lesions along the mucosa and in the mouth and on the coronary band. And so this is one that we really care about. We want to know, and so does Canada. And they care about it so much that it's really difficult to move animals across the border when we have these things. And the important thing that I always like to remind folks of is that, when we're private veterinarians, when we hear hoofbeats, we think about horses, but when we're state animal health officials and we're regulatory in nature, or we're working at a border, when we hear hoofbeats, we think about zebras, we think about all the weird things that it could be. That's really our job, and that's because all of these reportable diseases can look like endemic diseases, so diseases we see every day. So if we get a case of a pig with a vesicle on its nose, and it might be Seneca Valley virus, it doesn't matter. We still need to go out and do an investigation and make sure it's not foot and mouth disease, because we don't want to be that person who is just like, oh, well, it just kind of looks like it's Seneca Valley. Because we don't know until we do diagnostics. So it's very, very important that we get the diagnostics done so we can differentiate between these types of diseases. And so as you know, this year there was the outbreak of vesicular stomatitis. Again, this slide is from Angela Petzel-McCluskey. She's our equine lead with USDA, and so I want to credit her for this. And this is what it classically looks like. But we often have lesions that aren't as severe. And when those types of things show up at the border, like maybe it's a bit, or maybe it's hay, and they get this tiny little abrasion, all right? But what do? So as a state animal health official, or as a port veterinarian who inspects those animals, you're gonna say, well, how do I know? Unless you can show me that you have a negative test result to go with it. And the issue with vesicular stomatitis is it's reportable disease, to the states and federal animal health officials. So for example, that picture on your right, that's a lesion horse we just saw this week and did an investigation on. That turned out to be negative. But you wouldn't know, right, until you go out and do the investigation. That very much looks like it could be vesicular stomatitis, but it wasn't. So it's just a great example of how, when we look at these, what we have to do. So this year, the current situation is there's 123 affected premises, and actually there's 2 with bovine premises infections, and we have 1 in a rhinoceros in a wildlife park. And those are all in California. And again, California hasn't seen vesicular stomatitis since the 1980s. And so here's the sit rep from USDA APHIS. This is on their website, so if you're interested, you can always go there. If you're interested in vesicular stomatitis and you want to know what's trending over time, you can get on there and look. And I showed this slide earlier just to show that we're going to continue to see outbreaks of vesicular stomatitis as vectors change geographic range, especially with climate change. We're going to continue to see these types of outbreaks. And this year is a little bit unique that we saw it, instead of showing up in the west, we saw it show up in California in particular. I showed these slides this morning to just show how we're gonna have outbreaks every year. And currently, these are the counties that have had positive cases of vesicular stomatitis as of July 13th. This is the most recent sit rep from USDA. And so because of that, there's been some restrictions put in place. So this is the CFIA guidance on this. They were allowing for certain animals to move if they were show animals going to certain shows, and they had to follow some certain requirements. But this owned my life and Dr. Gibson's life for like weeks, right, Dr. Gibson? All we did was talk to horse people. We all know how fun that is. And what's happened is that, you know, we also have guidance from USDA on this as well. So yep, okay, so we have some guidance, we know what we need to do, we know we have to sign off. But one of the issues we're having is that these horses come up, and as Dr. Livesley mentioned this morning, they come up, they get to the border, and they have these lesions. These are real horse lesions from Washington of horses that were reported to us. This is what they look like. Okay, so CFIA turns these around. A lot of them are really mild lesions, but they have lesions. And they also moved on an international health certificate, which means a veterinarian saw these horses, signed off on these horses. But it could also mean they were in a trailer on their way from California, and they're chewing on a net, or they are eating some hay they shouldn't eat, or who knows? I mean, they're performance horses. They've got bits in their mouths. They're being trained. So this is the problem we have. So we have animals, these horses came to the border, and then a private veterinarian notified us. CFIA didn't notify us. USDA didn't notify us. We hadn't found out through a private vet who's like, whoa, I'm worried these horses came from California, and they have lesions that are consistent with vesicular stomatitis. Okay, so I'm mad, because I'm state veterinarian, and what are these horses even doing in my state, because they were destined to Canada, but nobody notified the state that they're here. So what am I supposed to do in that? So we have to do foreign animal disease investigations. As I mentioned, reportable diseases look like endemic diseases, and until we do the testing to rule it out, as far as I'm concerned, that's a positive horse. It came from California, it's high risk, and now it's in my state, and I didn't know anything about it. So I did draft these two letters to USDA and CFIA requesting notification for any animals that come to the border with lesions, or any animals that are, you know, supposed to go to Canada and get turned around. Because what happens is they don't say, hey, you gotta go back to the state of origin. They just don't go back to the state of origin. So technically, if a load of cattle or horses or whatever comes to the border and they get turned around, they are supposed to go back to the origin premises. Some of these animals have been on trailers for 14 hours. So I've also had cases of springing heifers coming up from Montana, or even farther from Montana. I think the last stopping place was in Montana. Get to the Sumas border crossing, get turned around for lesions, and you know where they ended up? At our sale barn. Yay, that's a great place for a bunch of springing heifers, because an animal had lost the tag. So, again, they're not gonna turn around and go back to Montana. They're gonna land right there on the border, and they're gonna try to work out their issues that they need to work out before they can get them back across the border. But it's a vulnerability, because the last thing I would think Canada wants is a bunch of springing heifers that just spent a bunch of time at a sale barn and got exposed to who knows what, right? And it also puts the market in a bad spot. So this is kind of where I wanted to leave this conversation is, you know, what happens, you know, party till the cows come home until they don't. And then so what happens when they don't get to where they need to go? Or they don't go home when they get turned around at the border. So it's become a really big problem for us in recent years. So either cattle that lose 840 tags and the whole load gets turned around because they can't prove that that animal had the proper testing done, or any animal that doesn't meet the Canadian or US requirements that get turned around for some reason, or any animal that originates out of state that's diverted to a state not listed on the CVI, so that's a problem. The other problem we have is animals coming down from Canada with a destination to a gas station address in Nebraska, but nobody cares, because once they cross the border, they're no longer USDA's problem, they're the state's problem. But we don't even know where they're going half the time. So it's become a huge issue that we've brought up with USDA, I know through our national association. And then any animal with lesions. So if an animal is turned around at the border and it has lesions, I want to know about it, because chances are it's going to end up in a stable or a farm or a sale barn in our bordering states, and we need to know about those so we can follow up with foreign animal disease investigations. So that's all I got. I'm going to hand it off to
Nice.
Yes.
I don't know if I need the mic. I'm not sure if we have any provision.
Here's some.
Oh, the quote's on there.
All right. So, 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 so,
have any provincial CBOs in the room, but for those state CBOs in the room, when you talk about animals being turned around at the border because of suspicion of a foreign animal disease, and we send them to a commingling site, that's highly problematic. And it seems to me that the last place that we want to send them is to a commingling site where they are going to spread this like wildfire. Like if you think of those spring heifers example, what if they had mouth lesions and potential FMD? So it seems to me that this is a conversation that this group could be talking about is facilities or strategic response plans that we have safe, biosecure options when animals are turned around at borders. Thanks.
I'm Scott Livesley, I'm the State Veterinarian of Idaho. I'd clarify that they're not being sent there. It's kind of like, you can't cross here,
Right.
so you gotta find somewhere else to go, and good luck with that. So I think sending them to a commingling site is the best place they can find to go. When you have a load of cattle that have a destination, but you're not being allowed to cross an international border, and well, you're gonna have to figure it out before we'll let you cross, so go hang out somewhere, and if you don't wanna turn tail and head all the way back to California, which most don't, you try to find the closest place it'll take you, which unfortunately is a sale yard or a feedlot. So I don't think anyone is intentionally telling them you need to go to a livestock facility to commingle with a naive population of cattle. You just need to go figure out your problems, and in the meantime, animal care, welfare issues, movement issues, disease exposure issues all come into play, but they're like, well, I gotta offload these cattle. And I think it's the best solution, not a good solution, the best solution they can come up with until they figure out whatever they need to figure out.
Yeah, and so like in the cattle example, you know, an animal lost the tag, the whole group basically had to redo the health certificates, they had to redo some of the testing, because then they're like, well, what if the animal that lost the tag actually had TB and it you know, exposed everybody on the trail? I'm like, oh my gosh, really? So it gets to the point where it's not even practical, but I agree, there aren't locations or facilities, and even like with the vesicular stomatitis ones, we really should have quarantined the entire stable. These are stables that are very active, that have events going on and farriers coming on and off and lessons, and I mean, if we actually had VS in those horses, it would have been a wreck, you know? So, and I do want to also, Maura, if you have anything you want to say, feel free, pipe in.
Yeah, just first of all, apologize for not introducing myself, Lee Rosengren with Canadian Cattle Association. And to your point, I think what you've stated is exactly my concern, is that they aren't being directed back to a secure location for that disease investigation. They're essentially being left figured out individually, and as a collective industry, that to me seems like a poor solution that we're dealing with collectively. So maybe an opportunity to, and I know there's no Canadian CBOs, but I don't think we're different on our side of the border, to my knowledge, that we have facilities set up either.
So, thank you, good discussion, and I think, you know, this is there's.
Could I just ask a question? And excuse my ignorance, but at this point, once this pops up, can the animals not be used for things such as dog feed or other animal byproduct feed? Oftentimes when lungs of a cow in transit get too warm, we would send them to the beef place and they'd become dog feed. So can we not, for the 123 cases pop up, save the whole network and still sell the cow not at a loss, but to an animal feed, like a dog or something like that?
If you can find a dog food company that's willing to pay prime cut weight prices, I think they may take you up on that, but that is a very significant economic loss for the producer. And while it may be a reasonable solution to the problem at the time, I mean, the reality is these animals were bred, raised, shipped with the intention, and most likely there's a contract in place. And so you can't just say, well, why don't you just take a 90% loss on your investment and go just take them down and sell them to the renderer or the dog food company. So I think there's more in play than just disease exposure, import requirements. I think there's a whole myriad of problems that need to be addressed. The least of which is the longer you keep the cattle on the trailer, you are literally losing money.
Yeah, and just real quick to the springing heifers, you know, they're worth a lot of money, so they might be $2,500, $3,000. But that delay at the border definitely adds expense for everybody involved, so that's a huge issue. And these horses,
some of them are like $100,000 horses.
Yeah. I don't disagree, but 123 cases, I mean, it's hard.
So you guys, sorry, I'm just looking at time. I didn't put my watch on. What are we doing for time? Because we've got, yeah, okay. So we've got a couple more presentations to go. Good discussion. I think that's part of what we hope to achieve with this group too, or what are those constrictions at the border, and so then how do we work towards rectifying it? So the idea of this panel up here is just to give some examples. So that's a really good example. I'll be really quick. I think that, you know, you said that a lot more cattle are coming up or leaving Montana to Canada. Actually, I have some stats in front of me. 247% increase since 2017 of feeder cattle that are coming from the US into Canada. So that's pretty significant. And I think this example, you know, I've said this a couple times, but one of my members has told me that one of the biggest constrictions for them is vets at the border. So same sort of thing. So do we open more ports, or maybe we just even have timing, because these ports are rural, right? So a lot, you know, to get a vet to sit in a rural location isn't always as easy. The auctions, when they're buying these feeder cattle in the US to bring them up to Canada, auctions oftentimes occur on a Thursday is like the prime time. So now you can't get your cattle back because you can't get a vet to cross the border because they're not there on the weekends. So that basically takes us out of the market. So that is a big concern. The other example I wanted to bring up, and I'm sure a lot of people are very aware of this, but you know, this is when, you know, on the news there was a lot of news about the protests that happened in Ottawa around the mandatory mandates for truckers to get vaccines in Canada. And but what they also did was they shut down a number of the borders, and Coots Sweetgrass was one of those borders that they shut down. And so trucks that were carrying cattle down to the US, mostly a lot live cattle for slaughter, they were blocked at the border and couldn't get across. And so what happened, and this was in your session, Lori, we talked about, but on the Canadian side industry, we had regular, almost daily calls with CFIA and CSBA, and we would say, okay, today there's 5 loads, they're coming down, they'll be there at approximately this time. And the CSBA worked really well with us and said, well, you can go across on this border. So you might have to drive quite a ways out of way, go on this border, and then come back. And we were trying to do it kind of secretively too, because we didn't want that border to also get closed down because they were monitoring that. The problem is, though, this had a lot of ramifications. So our regulations at CFIA is that you can only have an animal on a truck without feed and water, rest, feed and water, for 36 hours. So, you know, sitting at the border, that became a problem. And then also on the truck driving side, you have electronic logging devices, and they're only allowed to drive for 13 hours. So that became then a problem on how to report all of that. The packers were also getting backed up. So we couldn't take our cattle to the Canadian packers because they had their chilled beef, and they couldn't get their beef back across the border. So that became a problem. And then even empty trucks coming back from the US to Canada, we couldn't get empty trucks as well. So this went on for 18 days. It became a really major problem. But here's the positive that came out of it, is that the CFIA and I'm gonna get it wrong, APHIS, sorry, so Dr. Rosemary Sifford, who's the CBO from APHIS, and then we also had Mary Jane Ireland. They got together and they created this, it's an emergency transit policy for regulated animals. And so what they were able to do is that they said they could, and I'm going to read this because I don't want to get it wrong, but inspect animals, apply official seals to transport conveyances, issue a simplified export health certificate at either of the ports of exit, and then an official, by an official veterinarian with an accredited veterinarian or an official veterinarian. So this can be done. We got it done in emergency situations, I guess. What I would put forward is, how do we thin the border? And Amber and Mike have both brought up situations where, there might be complications, but I think generally as we're moving this amount of animals across the border, how do we make sure that we can be more efficient? So with that, sorry to cut off questions because questions are great. But with that, I think the next thing is we're going to invite up Rory McAlpine, and he's going to give us a bit of a discussion on what's the right balance between science and politics when managing a zoonotic disease. And Rory is a director on the Canadian Food Policy Institute, or CAFI. So thanks, Rory.
Well, thank you, Janice, and great to be back at PNWER. And thank you, Janice, and the cattle feeders for helping sponsor my participation. So look, I want to talk about science and politics of animal health and food safety. Firstly, do we have any legislators in the room? I need to know this before. Okay, we're safe. I guess first I need to explain why I think I do have a few relevant things to say about science and politics in relation to animal health and food safety. So I had an interesting career in agriculture, food and trade across 2 levels of government and the private sector in Canada, working in 3 countries abroad and in 3 Canadian provinces. And viruses, pathogens, prions, fungi, and contaminants seemed to follow me everywhere I went. From Salmonella enteritidis in eggs in 1990 to BSE in Europe in the mid-90s, to potato wart and PEI in 2000, to BSE in Alberta in 2003, to avian flu in BC in 2004, to listeriosis at Maple Leaf Foods in 2008, to multiple pig diseases and disease threats, PRS, swine flu, PEDV, and of course the dreaded ASF threat in Manitoba. And when I wrote that list, I said, then why would anyone invite me to speak in Idaho? You're taking a bit of a risk. So my hypothesis is that when it comes to animal health and food safety, science and politics, not versus politics, are both critical to successful risk assessment, risk management. And when I say risk management, I mean both prevention and response, and risk communications. But putting the right politicians and the right bureaucrats in the right roles at the right time, doing the right things, makes all the difference. Both when it is business as usual, or peacetime as we might say, and when it's business as very unusual, or a wartime type scenario. Science and politics are like the accelerator and brake on a car. Both are critical to operating the vehicle, but bad things happen when you mix them up. So what have I learned from all those nasty biological hazards that have punctuated my career? Let me talk about first what I call the pleasant and rare world of business as usual. As legislators with regulatory oversight and responsibility for food safety and animal health, the status quo will be your most powerful constituent. Why is that? Well, the negative consequences of misplaced regulatory experimentation are usually pretty obvious, i.e. people and animals get sick or die, borders close, industry complains. But the costs of regulatory stagnation on public or animal health or on economic opportunity are less apparent. As a result, science-based regulators and the lawyers that advise them are cautious and find organizational and career security playing in the sandbox they already know. They comfortably hold on to the regulatory power and the jobs, especially the unionized inspector jobs, that come with the power. And comfort with the regulatory status quo can equally derive from vested interests in industry and their consultants. Those that have built a business model on the economic advantages of that regulatory environment and the legal underpinnings. Very often, food and agriculture industry lobby groups must cater to the lowest common denominator and to the members who enjoy business advantage through measures that limit competition. And I can say this, I'll give one example, Maple Leaf Foods. Before the listeriosis crisis, we had resisted the approval of the use of sodium diacetate as an antimicrobial in ready-to-eat meats. Why? Because it was a competitive advantage to keep the imports out. Well, the absence of that antimicrobial contributed to the contamination in the meat that resulted in the deaths of 23 Canadians. Another example might be the border inspection houses in the US, which are private businesses that enjoy a nice monopoly position inspecting all those loads of Canadian meat that come across the border. They don't want the regulation to change. And even within a consumer-facing food company that, like the type I work for, the pros and cons of various regulatory and process regulations can vary across the marketing, manufacturing, and investor relations functions. But importantly, whereas regulators mostly have the power to only say no based on their legal authorities and the application of the precautionary principle in risk management, legislators have the power to say yes when it comes to legislative, regulatory, and governance innovation. This is why regulators periodically need a gentle political kick to find a more progressive path to achieving safer food, healthier plants and animals, and a cleaner environment. Legislators need to be peacetime champions for regulatory modernization, knowing, of course, that the key to good messaging is to emphasize the public health and safety benefits. The political downside, of course, is to suggest that it will do anything positive for big business, big ag, labor unions, foreign countries, or government finances. The agenda should be smart regulation, never deregulation. And 2-for-1 red tape reduction programs are a cop-out. As for inspiration, do not look north of the border. Canada ranks 35th out of 38 OECD countries for regulatory burden. And many urban Canadian members of Parliament see more regulation of our food system and its unhealthy products as the chocolate ice cream of good public policy. This is not easy because legislators are rarely scientific experts, but everyone can acquire some level of scientific literacy. This includes CEOs of companies. My CEO, Michael McCain at Maple Leaf Foods, pretty quickly became very knowledgeable about listeria. Your best weapon is in every briefing to simply ask the question, why? Do not let any regulator brief you on a problem without asking, why is this happening? How did it happen and what can be done to prevent it next time? And understand the basic theory of risk management, regardless of the hazard. A crisis is not business as usual, but being crisis prepared is. On your first day in office, officials are not going to brief you as a legislator on the crisis management plan. So on day 2, ask to see the plan, particularly the crisis management governance model, the decision hierarchy, and the communications plan, because by day 3, you may have a crisis. That was my experience with avian influenza in the Fraser Valley in 2004, which hit, and you know, to this day I regret that I hadn't already asked my staff and the organization what was the readiness plan for any foreign animal disease in the province. It comes too late. Legislators need to ensure that risk management, that is prevention, response, recovery planning, are well established through the regulatory toolkit, the hazard-specific playbooks, financial programming, professional competence, and inclusive ongoing simulation exercises. And I can say this recognizing my involvement with African swine fever preparedness and the frustration of getting ministers to take ownership of it, coupled with bureaucratic and jurisdictional diffusion. Remember, policy, program, and regulatory initiatives come cheap. Policy, program, and regulatory failures do not. Getting crisis prepared is difficult and slow. Getting overwhelmed in a crisis when you have failed to do so comes easy and fast. So for a legislator, the tough part in a business as usual world is usually is that policy, that is what really needs to get done, and politics, what you want to happen, are rarely the same thing. So legislators are rarely elected for policy prowess, but you can make sure you get a smart advisor, and I would say ideally someone over the age of 30, to tell you every day where good policy and good politics can intersect. The legislator is driving the car. Don't let the bureaucrats or stakeholders drive from the back seat, or worse still, tell you it's too risky to take the car out of the garage. And finally, political leadership matters too in the immediate aftermath of a crisis. Just when everyone wants to go on holiday or sleep for a month, your job is to drive a lessons learned postmortem exercise, forcing all stakeholders into a room and reporting transparently, something that Canada never did after the BSE crisis in 2003, and of course is not yet done in terms of COVID. You owe it to the person who next occupies your office. So now what about business not as usual? That is when the biohazards take charge and you have a crisis. Animal health and food safety, of course, are never on the front page unless they are all over the front page. The editorial page, the business page, and your mother's Facebook page. And the sad fact is that any legislator and with agri-food responsibilities would never enjoy any political advantage from a headline such as "Local food plant manufactures safe food today," even if it was on page 1. The realities of crisis leadership are clear. The stakes are much higher, the public is much more attentive, its mood is more volatile, and institutional constraints on decision-making are much looser. Any recent pandemics come to mind. So what does good political leadership look like in a food safety animal health crisis? It does not look like, and here can we put up the slide that I have? It does not look like this gentleman. Does anybody know who this is? This is Lord John Gummer. And on May 16, 1990, this was the day that Lord Gummer, well, he wasn't in the House of Lords yet. He was the UK Agriculture Minister. And in front of the cameras, he fed a hamburger to his daughter, Cordelia, to show that beef from BSE-infected cows could not possibly harm the little girl. Now remember, we're talking 1990. This was just, I suppose about a year after BSE was devastating the beef industry, but the connection between BSE and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease had not yet been made. And so he, as UK Agriculture Minister, pulled a bit of a political stunt. So what did he do wrong? In the midst of an evolving crisis, he used a political stunt to try to educate people about food safety risk. He did so without appropriate scientific evidence or competence to interpret the evidence, even if it did exist. And he tarnished government credibility by suggesting to both the public and to the experts government knows better. In the end, 178 UK citizens died of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, although not little Cordelia. He looks like a lord, doesn't he? Okay, we can take that down, thank you. In a public health or animal health crisis, the lead elected official and relevant industry leader must absolutely lead the crisis communications. The key deliverables are empathy, accountability, and action. The deliverables are not to belittle public fear, give false hope, or imply government knows best. Jokes are not appropriate. Some of us in Canada recall the listeriosis crisis in 2008 when our Minister of Agriculture made an inappropriate joke in the House of Commons, something about death by 1,000 cold cuts. Elected leaders need to express sorrow, promise transparent action, praise the experts, and then let the experts shine. Another example, I think back to the XL beef crisis in 2012, where then CFIA President George DuPont, in the middle of a press conference, was literally kind of physically pulled off the stage in front of the cameras because he was drifting into some political messaging, and the minister was there, and officials didn't like. It was just a terrible way to present, a serious message to the public. In my experience, besides always starting on a Friday afternoon, a crisis nearly always seems to drag on much longer than you expect. And on day 30, the media has not forgotten the expectations you defined on day 1. You need to sustain an image of professionalism and competency day after day. I call that the Vladimir Zelensky formula. When something bad happens on your watch, you may call it a crisis, but someone else is calling it a funeral for a loved one. In fact, for that reason, Maple Leaf Foods to this day calls the listeriosis crisis a tragedy, not a crisis. But beyond the public communications role, effective political leadership in a crisis is about strategic decision-making, not operational decision-making. And that's very hard with a rapidly unfolding crisis with poor and changing facts on the ground. Because operational decision-making, i.e. what you need to do in the next 24 hours, is much easier than strategic decision-making, which is what you need to be doing in the next couple of weeks or in the next month. As a leader, you can be highly motivated to just join the troops on the front line and end up just getting in the way. But it's behind the scenes that a legislator's leadership can make all the difference. That is, convening the right players to define strategic priorities, demanding answers, but not grinding your staff to spend more time briefing you than actually managing the crisis, running interference for your experts, securing buy-in from key actors outside of government for critical steps. And those are those evening phone calls that are always critical to get things done in a crisis. Keeping your boss, if you're a legislator, that probably means the governor or the premier, informed, but mostly sidelined. And freeing up the emergency funds, liaising with political leaders elsewhere across borders and time zones, sustaining a consistent message track, and visiting the scene and providing encouragement, reassurance, and hope. Again, I think of Zelensky in the war in Ukraine. But I think too of my minister at the time of avian flu in the Fraser Valley, John Van Dongen, who had a real knack for being present at the right time, but then standing back and letting us do the work without getting in the way. And so now to conclude, I wanted to mention a couple of examples where political leadership and courage could make a big difference to a couple of very important peacetime initiatives. One is uniquely Canadian and the other is uniquely cross-border. Now the first one, I actually not going to say much about. That's Animal Health Canada, because Dr. Rosengren is going to talk about it, and I was quite instrumental in the early establishment of Animal Health Canada. And maybe once you do your talk, I can add some perspective on where I see it now and where I envisage or want it to go, if it can be successful. And specifically thinking more of a public-private partnership beyond just kind of a coalition of interests. But the second one then I'll say a few words about is the idea of a US-Canada food safety risk assessment organization. And I'm going to say food safety, but this is equally true of animal health. You could always use them interchangeably, but I'm going to describe it in the context of food safety, and maybe you would react and say, well, why don't we try it in animal health? I hope you would say so. And it may be one actually that PNWER would want to think about and ideally advocate for both in Washington and Ottawa. In fact, Cargill and Maple Leaf Foods tried to advance this idea during the NAFTA renegotiation, but somehow auto rules of origin and investor-state dispute settlement took center stage. But the concept here is to better integrate US and Canadian food safety risk assessment to mirror the integration of our food systems. As it is now, the Canadian and US approaches to food safety risk assessment are highly congruent because they are based on the best science, the most proven food safety management models, HACCP, obviously, and a strong regulatory foundation for setting standards and enforcing them. And this, of course, was strengthened significantly by FSMA in the US, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and its counterpart in Canada, the Safe Food for Canadians Act. So the question is, why do we undertake scientific risk assessments to identify and characterize hazards, determine exposure to those hazards, and approve technologies and best practices to mitigate the hazards separately? These back office functions of effective food safety or animal health risk management could be brought together to better ensure regulatory decisions, whether they are done independently or jointly, are grounded in the best science, delivered at the earliest stage of decision making with less bureaucracy and duplication of effort, and faster time to market for food safety innovations. At the multilateral level, this of course is the business of the Codex Alimentarius in Rome, but I'm pretty sure we can work much more efficiently in North America. This is not about compromising any country's right to establish its own level of protection in a regulatory standard, which of course is a fundamental principle of SPS agreements, both under CUSMA and under the WTO. Some examples of how disjointed risk assessments create some very bizarre outcomes are as follows. And these have suboptimal outcomes both for consumer protection and for bilateral